A single photon of ultraviolet light is about to change your body. One particle. Nothing more than a tiny packet of energy that left the surface of the sun just over 8 minutes ago. It traveled across 93 million miles of empty space at the fastest speed anything in the universe can move. And right now, it is about to collide with your skin. When it does, something almost invisible will happen. That photon carries about 4.4 electron volts of energy. Not enough to burn you, not enough to feel, but enough to do one very specific thing. It will break a single chemical bond inside a molecule sitting in the outer layer of your skin. One bond. That is all it takes. Within the next 48 hours, that broken bond will be transformed into a hormone. And that hormone will go on to control the activity of more than 200 genes inside your body. Genes that regulate your bones, your immune system, your mood, your sleep, even your blood pressure. Everything that sunlight does to you begins here, at this exact moment, with one photon breaking one bond. Now here is where it becomes even stranger. From your perspective, that photon took 8 minutes to reach you. But from the photon's perspective, the journey never happened at all. According to special relativity, time does not pass for anything traveling at the speed of light. For that photon, the moment it left the sun and the moment it hit your skin are the same instant. Cause and effect collapse into a single event. Creation and absorption become one. But for you, the effect unfolds slowly. A chain reaction begins. A molecular change that spreads outward, moving from your skin to your bloodstream, to your organs, to your DNA. You do not feel it. You do not notice it. But it is happening right now. And it is happening every time you step into sunlight. The question is not whether this process exists. The physics is already settled. The chemistry is already mapped. The biology has been measured in detail. The question is something much simpler. If your body depends on this process to function properly, what happens when it stops receiving the photons it was built to use? Here is what actually happens in the first fraction of a second after that photon hits your skin. It does not spread out. It does not bounce around randomly. It is absorbed by a very specific target, a molecule called 7-dehydrocholesterol sitting inside the membranes of your skin cells. This molecule is not there by accident. Your body makes it on purpose and places it exactly where incoming ultraviolet light can reach it. It is waiting for that photon. The wavelength of the photon matters. Only a narrow band of ultraviolet light between about 290 and 315 nanometers has the right amount of energy to trigger this reaction. Too little energy and nothing happens. Too much and you start causing damage instead of transformation. But within this narrow range, something precise occurs. The photon is absorbed by a structure inside the molecule known as the B ring. This ring is a hexagonal arrangement of carbon atoms held together by chemical bonds that are stable under normal conditions. Stable, but not unbreakable. The energy carried by that single photon is just enough to target one specific bond inside that ring. The bond between carbon 9 and carbon 10. When the photon is absorbed, that bond snaps. Not metaphorically, physically. A rearrangement begins instantly. The closed ring structure opens. The geometry of the molecule changes. And once that bond is broken, the molecule is no longer what it was before. It has crossed a threshold. It is now something new. Pre-vitamin D3. This transformation happens in less than a trillionth of a second. There is no gradual transition. One moment the bond exists. The next moment it does not. And that single structural change is the trigger for everything that follows. Without that bond breaking, nothing else in the cascade can occur. No hormone, no gene activation, no downstream effects, just an inert molecule sitting in your skin, waiting. But once the bond is broken, the system is set in motion. The molecule has absorbed energy from sunlight and converted it into a new chemical form. This is photochemistry at its most fundamental level. Light becoming structure, energy becoming biology. And it only happens if the photon arrives. Now the molecule has changed, but it is not finished. Pre-vitamin D3 is unstable. It cannot stay in this form for long, and your body does not need it in this form anyway. What happens next does not require another photon. It does not require sunlight at all. It happens because of heat. Your body temperature, sitting at around 37 degrees Celsius, provides just enough energy to slowly rearrange the structure of this new molecule. This process is called thermal isomerization. It is slower than the initial photon impact. Not instantaneous, but gradual, unfolding over hours. The shape of the molecule shifts again. Bonds rotate, angles adjust, and over the course of the next 1 to 2 days, previtamin D3 becomes vitamin D3, also known as cholecalciferol. At this point, most people think the process is complete. You made vitamin D, that is the end of the story. But in reality, this is only the beginning. Vitamin D3 in this form is still inactive. It is not yet the molecule that will affect your genes. It is more like a precursor, a raw material that needs to be processed further. So it leaves your skin, it enters your bloodstream, and travels to your liver. There, enzymes add a hydroxyl group to the molecule, converting it into calcidiol. This is the form that circulates in your blood and is commonly measured in medical tests when doctors check your vitamin D levels. But even now, it is still not fully active. The final step happens in your kidneys. Another hydroxyl group is added, transforming calcidiol into calcitriol. This is the active form. This is the hormone. And now, the scale of what began with a single photon starts to become clear, because calcitriol does not stay in your blood doing nothing. It moves into your cells. It passes through the cell membrane. It enters the nucleus. And inside the nucleus, it binds to specific receptors that sit directly on your DNA. These receptors are not passive. They are transcription factors. When calcitriol binds to them, it changes which genes are turned on and which are turned off. What started as light has now become genetic control. A signal from the sun has been translated into instructions inside your cells. And this is the point where physics, chemistry, and biology are no longer separate. They are the same process continuing forward. Once calcitriol binds to those receptors on your DNA, the system shifts from chemistry into control. This is no longer just a molecule floating in your bloodstream. This is a signal that determines what your cells actually do. The receptors that calcitriol activates are attached directly to specific regions of your DNA. When they are turned on, they begin the process of transcription. Certain genes are read, others are ignored, and this selection changes the behavior of your cells in measurable ways. One of the most immediate effects happens in your digestive system. Calcitriol increases the expression of proteins that absorb calcium from your food. Without it, your intestines capture only a small fraction of the calcium you consume. With it, absorption can more than double. The difference determines whether your body has enough raw material to maintain bone density or whether it has to start pulling calcium out of your skeleton to keep essential systems running. But the influence does not stop there. In your bones, calcitriol regulates the activity of cells responsible for building and remodeling bone tissue. It helps maintain the balance between formation and breakdown. In your immune system, it activates genes that allow immune cells to respond more effectively to pathogens. It enhances the production of antimicrobial peptides that directly attack bacteria and viruses. In your muscles, it influences protein synthesis and coordination. In your cells more broadly, it plays a role in regulating growth and preventing uncontrolled division. Over 200 genes are affected by this single pathway, not in isolation, but as part of an integrated system that keeps your body stable and responsive to its environment. And all of this traces back to that first moment when a photon broke a bond in your skin. Without that initial trigger, this entire chain remains inactive. The receptors sit idle. The genes remain unexpressed. The processes that depend on them operate below their optimal level. What makes this even more striking is the scale. A brief exposure to sunlight can produce thousands of international units of vitamin D, far exceeding what most dietary sources provide. Your skin is not passively receiving light. It is actively converting it into a hormone that regulates fundamental biological functions. It is a system designed to run continuously under natural conditions. And when that input is reduced or removed, the effects do not stay isolated. They propagate through every system those genes influence, quietly altering the way your body functions over time. There was a time when you did not need to think about any of this. You were already doing it. You woke up and went outside without planning it. You spent hours in sunlight without measuring exposure, without calculating wavelengths, without worrying about molecules or hormones or gene expression. You ran, you walked, you sat in the sun, and every system we have just described was operating at full capacity without your awareness. The photons arrived, the reactions happened, the cascade ran exactly as it was designed to run. And because it worked, you never noticed it. That is how most essential biological systems behave. They are invisible when they function correctly. The change did not happen all at once. It happened gradually. School moved indoors. Work moved indoors. Transportation shifted from walking to sitting. Time outside became something scheduled instead of automatic. Later, responsibilities increased. Hours compressed. Exposure to sunlight became incidental, something that happened through a window, filtered and reduced instead of direct and sufficient. And over time, something subtle began to change. Not a sudden failure, not something you could point to in a single moment, but a slow reduction in input. Fewer photons reaching your skin, fewer signals entering your system. The cascade still exists. The molecules are still there. The receptors are still waiting, but the trigger arrives less often. As the years pass, the shift becomes more pronounced. Movement decreases. Outdoor time shrinks. The routines that once placed you in sunlight without effort are replaced by patterns that keep you inside for most of the day. And this is where the problem becomes difficult to see. Because nothing immediately breaks, the system does not shut down. It continues to operate, but at a lower level, slightly less efficient, slightly less responsive, just enough to function, but not enough to optimize. And because the change is gradual, it feels normal. You adapt to it without realizing what has been reduced. What your body expects and what it receives begin to diverge, not because you chose to ignore it, but because your environment changed around you. The design of your body did not change. It still expects the same input it always did, but the conditions you live in no longer provide it automatically. And that gap between what your biology was built for and what your daily life delivers is where the consequences begin to accumulate. Now take that gap and place it into the larger system your body actually exists in. Because sunlight is not constant. It changes with geography. It changes with seasons. And these changes are not subtle. They are governed by the geometry of the Earth's orbit and the angle at which sunlight passes through the atmosphere. If you live above roughly 35 degrees latitude, something very specific happens every year. As winter approaches, the sun sits lower in the sky. The light has to travel through more atmosphere before it reaches you. And that extra distance matters because the atmosphere absorbs ultraviolet B radiation. The exact wavelengths your skin needs to trigger the reaction we described earlier. By the time the light reaches the ground, most of those photons are gone, not reduced, removed. From approximately November through February in northern regions, the UVB intensity drops below the threshold required to produce meaningful amounts of vitamin D in your skin. The molecule is still there. The system is still ready, but the photons never arrive. And because of that, your vitamin D levels begin to decline. Slowly at first, then steadily. From October through March, population studies show the same pattern across entire regions. Levels fall month by month until they reach their lowest point at the end of winter. And this is where the consequences begin to line up. Your immune system, which depends on the hormone produced by that photon-triggered reaction, is now operating with reduced input. The same period when respiratory infections peak is the period when your vitamin D levels are at their lowest. Not because of coincidence, but because of physics. The Earth tilts, the angle changes, the photons disappear, and your biology responds accordingly. What makes this even more important is that the system does not compensate automatically. Your body cannot create UVB photons. It cannot replace that missing input internally. If the light is not there, the reaction does not occur, and so the deficit accumulates. Month after month, the gap between what your body expects and what it receives widens. And for many people, especially those who already spend most of their time indoors, the seasonal drop is layered on top of an already reduced baseline. The result is not just a temporary fluctuation. It is a compounded deficit, shaped by both environment and behavior, quietly altering the internal balance of systems that depend on a signal from the sun. This is where the science becomes uncomfortable, because the conclusion is not universally agreed upon. For years, the dominant message in dermatology was simple: avoid the sun. Ultraviolet radiation damages DNA. It increases the risk of skin cancer. The safest exposure is no exposure at all. And at a surface level, that logic makes sense. The damage is real. The mechanism is understood. But it is not the whole picture. Researchers like Michael Holick, who spent decades studying vitamin D metabolism, began to argue something different. Not that the sun is harmless, but that the dose matters. That moderate exposure is not only safe within limits, but necessary. That removing sunlight entirely from human life creates a different kind of risk, one that unfolds more slowly and is less visible, but just as real. This position was not widely accepted. In fact, it cost him professionally. He was pushed out of his dermatology department for promoting controlled sun exposure. The disagreement was not about whether ultraviolet light causes damage. It does. The disagreement was about whether avoiding it completely produces better overall outcome. And when you look at the data beyond skin cancer alone, the answer becomes less clear. Because sunlight is not just a risk factor, it is also an input. Remove the input, and you remove the processes that depend on it. At the same time, another layer of complexity emerges from something you carry with you everywhere: your skin color, the pigment that determines it. Melanin is not just cosmetic, it is functional. Melanin absorbs ultraviolet radiation before it can penetrate deeper into your skin. This protects your DNA from damage, but it also blocks the photons needed to drive the vitamin D reaction. The more melanin you have, the fewer photons reach the molecules waiting beneath, which means the same amount of sunlight produces less vitamin D in darker skin compared to lighter skin. This is not a flaw, it is an adaptation. In regions near the equator, where ultraviolet radiation is intense year-round, higher melanin provides necessary protection. In regions farther from the equator, where UVB is weaker and more seasonal, lighter skin allows more photons through, maintaining the balance required for vitamin D production. The biology matches the geography, but in the modern world, people move. Populations no longer live exclusively in the environments they evolved in. And when someone with high melanin skin lives at a northern latitude, the system becomes mismatched. Less UVB from the environment and more filtering at the skin. The result is a compounded reduction in the signal. The physics does not adjust for this. The photons that are absorbed do not reach their target. And the molecules waiting in the skin remain unchanged, not because the system failed, but because the input never arrived in sufficient quantity. Now, sunlight is doing something else entirely, and this time it has nothing to do with your skin. It is happening in your eyes, not in the part that lets you see, but in a system most people do not even know exists. Behind the rods and cones in your retina are specialized cells called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. They do not form images. They do not help you recognize faces or read text. Their only job is to measure light. Specifically, they are tuned to a narrow band of blue light, around 480 nanometers. And when they detect that light, they send a signal directly into your brain, not to the visual cortex, but to a small structure in your hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This structure is your master circadian clock. It controls the timing of almost every biological process in your body. When you feel alert, when you feel tired, when your body temperature rises and falls, when hormones are released, all of it runs on a roughly 24-hour cycle. And that cycle has to be reset every day. The signal that resets it is light. But not just any light, the intensity matters. Typical indoor lighting produces somewhere between 100 and 500 lux. That feels bright enough to see clearly. But for the cells that regulate your circadian rhythm, it is barely a signal at all. They require closer to 1,000 to 2,000 lux to activate properly. And outdoor light, even in the shade on a cloudy day, can reach 10,000 to 25,000 lux. Direct sunlight can exceed 100,000. The difference is not small. It is an order of magnitude, which means that if you spend most of your time indoors, your circadian system is receiving only a fraction of the input it was designed for. And when that happens, the clock begins to drift. Not dramatically at first, about 12 minutes per day, but that adds up. Over the course of a week, your internal timing can shift by more than an hour. Over a month, it becomes completely misaligned with the actual day-night cycle of the Earth. The result is not just poor sleep. It is a breakdown in timing across multiple systems. You feel tired when you should be alert, alert when you should be asleep. Hormones are released at the wrong time. Body temperature cycles lose their rhythm. And the longer this continues, the weaker the signal becomes, especially with age. Because as you get older, the lens of your eye gradually yellows. It begins to filter out more of the blue light that these cells depend on. So even when light reaches your eyes, less of the critical wavelength gets through. The signal is reduced from both sides. Less exposure and less transmission. And the system that depends on that signal begins to lose its precision. What restores it is not a drug, not a supplement, not a device. It is light, bright outdoor light entering your eyes early in the day, providing the signal your brain was designed to receive. That same light signal does not stop at your circadian clock. It continues deeper into your brain, influencing a system that directly shapes how you feel. When those light-sensitive cells in your retina activate, part of their signal is routed to regions responsible for producing serotonin. This is not an indirect effect. It is measurable. Studies that sampled blood draining directly from the brain have shown that serotonin production increases in response to bright light exposure. More light, more serotonin. Less light, less serotonin. And this relationship holds regardless of temperature, regardless of season, regardless of what you think or believe. It is a physical response to photon input. Serotonin is often described as a mood regulator, but it is more than that. It is also the precursor to melatonin, the hormone that controls sleep. During the day, light exposure drives serotonin production. At night, that serotonin is converted into melatonin, initiating the process that allows you to fall asleep and stay asleep. This creates a continuous chain. Light during the day builds the chemical foundation for sleep at night. If the input is low, the entire chain is weakened. Low light means lower serotonin. Lower serotonin means less melatonin, and less melatonin means disrupted sleep, which leads to fatigue the next day, less time outside, even less light exposure, and the cycle continues downward. This is not theoretical. It is the basis of seasonal affective disorder, where reduced daylight during winter months leads to measurable changes in mood and energy. Treatments that use bright light at specific intensities can reverse these effects not by changing your thoughts, but by restoring the missing input. And while this is happening in your brain, something else is happening again in your skin through a completely different mechanism. This time it is not about vitamin D, it is about nitric oxide. Your skin stores this molecule in chemical forms that remain inactive until they are triggered. When ultraviolet A radiation reaches these stores, it releases nitric oxide directly into your bloodstream. This molecule relaxes the smooth muscle in your blood vessels, causing them to dilate. As they widen, blood pressure drops. This effect can occur within minutes of sun exposure and can last for hours. It is independent of the vitamin D pathway, a separate system activated by a different wavelength of light, producing a completely different outcome, which means that sunlight is not acting on a single pathway in your body. It is simultaneously influencing multiple systems through different mechanisms, all triggered by the same source. Light enters through your eyes and adjusts your brain chemistry. Light enters through your skin and alters your cardiovascular system. And all of it depends on whether those photons reach you in the first place. And this is where the full picture comes into focus, because the same light that drives all of these beneficial processes also carries a cost. Ultraviolet radiation does not distinguish between the molecules you need to activate and the DNA you need to protect. The same UVB photons that break the bond in 7-dehydrocholesterol can also create damage in your genetic material. Specifically, they can cause adjacent bases in your DNA to bind together in ways they should not, forming lesions that interfere with normal replication. Your body is not defenseless against this. Every cell in your skin contains repair mechanisms designed to detect and correct this damage. Enzymes scan your DNA, cut out the affected sections, and rebuild them using the intact strand as a template. This process is happening constantly, thousands of times per day, keeping the system stable under normal conditions. But it is not perfect, and it is not unlimited. As exposure increases, the amount of damage can begin to exceed the capacity of the repair system. Over time, unrepaired errors accumulate, and some of those errors can lead to mutations that increase the risk of skin cancer. This is the trade-off. The same photons that sustain critical biological functions can also introduce risk, but like everything else in this system, the outcome depends on dose. At low to moderate levels of exposure, the benefits dominate. The hormonal cascade runs, blood pressure decreases, circadian rhythms align, immune function improves, and the repair systems keep up with the damage being produced. There is a range where the system operates as it was designed to operate, and that range is narrower than most people think. Roughly 10 to 20 minutes of direct sunlight on exposed skin is enough to drive near maximal vitamin D production, stimulate nitric oxide release, and provide a strong circadian signal through your eyes, all while remaining within the capacity of your body's repair mechanisms. Beyond that window, the balance begins to shift. The benefits plateau, but the damage continues to accumulate. This is why both extremes are incomplete. Avoiding sunlight entirely removes the input your body depends on. Excessive exposure overwhelms the systems designed to manage it. The optimal point sits between those extremes. And when you step back and look at the entire chain, from a photon leaving the surface of the sun, to a hormone regulating your genes, to a signal aligning your brain, to a molecule lowering your blood pressure, the conclusion is difficult to ignore. Your body was built to interact with sunlight, not constantly, not without limits, but regularly, consistently, as part of its normal operation. And when that interaction is removed, the effects do not appear all at once. They accumulate slowly, across systems, across time, the kind of change that is easy to overlook until the consequences become impossible to ignore. So the next time you step outside and feel sunlight on your skin, you are not just experiencing warmth, you are supplying your body with a signal it has been waiting for, a signal that begins with a single photon and ends by shaping how your body functions at every level.